continuing as I have indicated with the fallacies. So we are looking at fallacies of ambiguity today. Fallacies of ambiguity occurs or arises when the occurrence of some form of ambiguity in either the premise or the conclusion or both. An expression is ambiguous if it is susceptible to different interpretation in a given context. So anytime a word has more than one meaning, it is ambiguous. So that is how the fallacy of ambiguity comes to be or comes to play. The words light and bank can be ambiguous in themselves. They can mean different things. But for light, even light alone, the word light can tend to even be vague because it can have several other meanings. But when you come to the word bank, it is ambiguous. It will have about two meanings. So we are saying that anytime you are using terminology that has different meaning or that gives rise to ambiguity in your statement, in your argument, then a fallacy has come about. So we'll look at the statement: tuna are biting off the Washington coast. When the conclusion of an argument depends on a shift in meaning of an ambiguous word or a phrase, or on the wrong interpretation of an ambiguous statement, the argument commits a fallacy of ambiguity, as I have indicated. And there are two examples of those kinds of fallacies. We have the equivocation, and then we have the amphiboly. Okay. All right. Equivocation and then amphiboly. So with equivocation, conclusion depends on a shift in meaning of a word or a phrase. Conclusion depends on a shift in meaning of a word or phrase. So as I've said, so once you use a term that has different meaning, right, in an argument, you may be tempted to conclude on one of the meaning rather than all. So those aspects of language needs to be looked at carefully. Equivocation also means to slide between two or more different meanings of a word or phrase that is crucial to the argument. For an argument to work, the words must have the same meaning throughout the premises and the conclusion. So if you use a term that does not have the same meaning throughout the argument, maybe you use that word or term twice in the argument, maybe in the two premises, and in each premise the word means something, you will have a problem. You are going to definitely have a problem, because if the meaning suggested by the same word are different, then you'll be committing the fallacy of equivocation. So I want us to look at an example of the fallacy of equivocation. Example one: the church would like to encourage theism. The church would like to encourage theism. Theism is a medical condition resulting from the excessive consumption of tea. Therefore, the church ought to freely distribute tea. Right. The term theism means two different things. As it is used in the first statement, the meaning in the first statement is not the same as the meaning in the second statement. For instance, the meaning in the first statement suggests the belief in God. Okay, the practice where people will say they have a belief in God. That is theism. But theism, as used in the second premise, is dealing with a medical condition. So there are two different meanings. So this is where this is what we call the equivocation, because the meaning have been shifted and the conclusion has been built on the shifting or the meaning of the meaning that has shifted. So if you do that, then you're going to have a problem. Example 2, some triangles are obtuse. Whatever is obtuse is ignorant. Therefore, some triangles are ignorant. So you see, obtuse in the um, first statement or in the first premise refer to a kind. It refers to a kind of triangle. But obtuse in the second premise means something different. This is talking about a condition, a human condition. Okay? It's talking about a human condition. So the meanings have shifted. So here, the fallacy of equivocation has been committed. So if you want to construct a very good argument, make sure that your terms, the use of your terms, the meaning that they convey stays singular. They do not mean two different things. Now look at example 3. Any law can be repealed by the legislative authority. Any law, and this is talking about legal issues. Now we move on. But the law of gravity is a law. Therefore, the law of gravity can be repealed by the legislative authority. So here again, do you see the problem that arises? The problem here is that you are referring to a legal issue and then quickly you shifted to a scientific issue. So here there's a problem. Meanings have shifted and it poses a kind of misunderstanding to what you are leading your audience to. Sometimes some of these things are done deliberately. The people who sometimes commit some of these fallacies, they do them deliberately just to mislead people. So you always have to be careful and you have to be evaluative. You always have to pay attention and evaluate whatever you hear before you concur or before you give it a nod or a thumbs up. So pay attention to these sort of issues closely and carefully. Then the fourth type, the fourth example. So we have a duty to do what is right. We have a duty to do what is right. And then the second statement, which is the second premise, we have a right to speak out in defense of the innocent. And the conclusion, therefore, we have a duty to speak out in defense of the innocent. So you see, the conclusion has been built on the shifted meaning. So it poses a problem. It is not clear because the right, the word right, has been used in two different senses. So that is a type of fallacy of ambiguity, and we always need to watch them out. Then we have the amphiboly, the fallacy of amphiboly. Now, amphiboly, conclusion depends on the wrong interpretation of a syntactically ambiguous statement. Okay, so you have a statement grammatically, you see that the placement of the words actually don't mean anything or actually means something else. You will think that you are suggesting this meaning, but the meaning that is occurring is not exactly what has been captured in the sentence. Then, on the basis of the wrong ambiguous statement, the conclusion is built. So the fallacy of amphiboly occurs in arguing from premises whose formulations are ambiguous because of their grammatical constructions. So if you are constructing a sentence and you don't pay attention to it very well, you misplace word order, you misplaced word order, the sentence will end up meaning something else. So you always have to pay attention to your word order when you are constructing a sentence. So you have to know, should an adverb come before a verb or a verb comes before an adverb? Should an adjective come before a noun or a noun comes before an adjective? Those issues have to be looked at. And sometimes you are using a verb before the noun or the subject. Should it be so? Are you asking a question? So you need to understand some of these nitty-gritties because the wrong grammatical construction will lead to a wrong interpretation or a wrong meaning to be formulated. Now let's look at a few examples. The tour guide said that standing in Greenwich Village, the Empire State the Empire State Building could easily be seen. So look at it very well. The tour guide said, standing in Greenwich Village, the Empire State Building could easily be seen. Is it the Empire State Building that is going to see, or it is the individual that is going to see the Greenwich Village, or it is the individual standing at the Greenwich Village that will be seeing the Empire State Building? So there's a problem there. Now you look at the conclusion. It follows that the Empire State Building is in Greenwich Village. So it's a wrong interpretation. Wrong interpretation. So there's a problem. So when you wrongly construct a sentence and then you build your conclusion on the wrong interpretation of that particular statement, you have caused the fallacy of amphiboly. John told Henry that he had made a mistake. John told Henry that he had made a mistake. It follows that John has at least the courage to admit his own mistakes. Now, there's a problem here. Is it John that is being told by Henry that John has made a mistake? Or Henry is telling John that Henry, has made a mistake? So that statement is ambiguous. And the conclusion has been built on the wrong interpretation thereof. Now let's look at the last example. Professor Johnson said that he will give a lecture about heart failure in the biology lecture hall. Professor Johnson said that he will give a lecture about heart failure in the biology lecture hall. It must be the case that a number of heart failures have occurred there recently. So these are problems that you have to always pay attention to so that you can avoid these sort of fallacies. Then we'll look at the last group of fallacies, that is the fallacies of grammatical analogy. The fallacies of grammatical analogy. The fallacies of grammatical analogy include composition and division. In other words, there are two types, and they are basically composition and division. Arguments that commit these fallacies are grammatically analogous to other arguments that are good in every respect. Because of this similarity in linguistic structure, such fallacious arguments may appear good, yet they are bad. So let's look at composition. In the fallacy of composition, attribute is wrongly transferred from part to whole. So you have one attribute or a simple attribute or a particular attribute being transferred to a whole, or from part to a whole thing to apply to every other thing. This fallacy involves an inference from the attribution of some feature to every individual member of a class or part of a greater whole, the possession of the same feature by the entire class or whole. So what it implies is, for instance, in this very class, we probably figure out a particular attitude in the class, right? We know that you are all students and you are all first year students, and we kind of figure out something like that. You'll be tempted to think that because we are addressing students, especially in the first year, and we have found out this particular attitude or something of the sort in one member of the class, then we apply it to every other person in the class. That is where a problem is. That is where the fallacy of composition comes into being, because you are now attributing wrongly, transferring a part, an issue that applies to a part or to one part or to an only part, to a whole group, to a whole class. This is what is being talked about. So now let's look at an example. So you look at the diagram closely, you see the composition, you see the structure. So you see components, you see different members, and then you have seen an attribute belonging to one part. Then you transfer that attribute belonging to one part to every other class or to the larger class. You are going to have problem. It does not mean that it cannot be done. It can, but you have to understand the scenario, and You have to understand the circumstance really closely before you try constructing such argument. So let's look at an example. Every course I took in college was well organized. Therefore, my college education was well organized. So you see, this is where the fallacy of composition comes into being. The part does not necessarily means the whole. So the courses you took in college, irrespective of which courses they are, and their organization does not mean it can be reflective in the entire college, the entire education system. So you are transferring a quality of a part to a whole system. So there's a problem. It's just like meeting one Ghanaian abroad or meeting one Ghanaian in a country or somewhere who tend to be humble, good, intelligent, smart, and etc. Any good qualities that you can give to that individual, you go ahead to do that, to subscribe to that person. Then, on the basis of just meeting this person and then maybe probably even a few others, then on that basis, you say Ghanaians are like this, Ghanaians are like that. You have committed the fallacy of composition. Even if the premise is true of each and every component of my curriculum, the whole could have been a chaotic mess. So this reasoning is defective, as I have enumerated or as I have indicated earlier. Okay. Then we have the division. In the fallacy of division, here is the opposite the of the composition. In the division, you wrongly transfer qualities of a whole to a part. The qualities of a whole to a part. So he said, you look at the diagram well, you see the whole, the qualities of the whole, the complete. You transfer it to maybe one member. That is an attribution or improper attribution to part. So you commit a fallacy. So let's look at example here. Salt is non-poisonous compound. Therefore, its component element, sodium and chlorine, are non-poisonous. So you see, salt on the whole, completely as a whole, is a non-poisonous compound. We agree. But salt is produced from these other two elements, sodium and chlorine. If you take sodium alone, it is poisonous. If you take chlorine alone, it is poisonous. So that is why you cannot attribute the quality of the whole to the part, to the specific. You commit a fallacy. So you always have to look at this well. So you see, two poisonous elements have come together to give us a non-poisonous compound. Two poisonous compound, two independent poisonous compound put together has given us a non-poisonous compound, which is the salt. So knowing that salt is not poisonous does not mean that when you isolate their elements, they will also not be poisonous. So this is where the wrong thinking comes in. So we look at the second example. This jigsaw puzzle, when assembled, is circular in shape. Therefore, each piece is circular in shape. Again, there's a problem here. Then the last one, the Royal Society is over 300 years old. Professor Thompson is a member of the Royal Society. Therefore, Professor Thompson is over 300 years old. So you see clearly how the problem is. So the society as a whole, its attribute for its existence is that it is about 3 centuries old. So on the basis that Professor Thompson, who is a member of the society, does not qualify to say that he has existed for that long. So please, when you are making an argument, look out for some of these issues. If not, you will easily be committing fallacies. All right. So this is where I'll end. So before I try to summarize and tell you about how to prevent fallacies, if you have a question, kindly ask. Okay. In the absence of any question, you need to make every effort to prevent fallacies in your day-to-day conversation. You need to do everything possible to prevent it. So how do you go about it? One, pretend to argue against yourself. So anytime you are trying to construct an argument or to put out an argument, try as much as possible, or just pretend that the argument is not you. So it's not you trying to put it out, but you are putting it out to yourself. So you are the one going to listen to somebody. So you are listening to yourself, and then you pretend to argue against yourself and examine it. So once you can do that, you will be open enough to, and you'll be willing enough to open yourself up to see if there are challenges with that particular argument. If there are challenges, you will avoid them. Number two, list the evidence for each of your main points. List the evidence for each of your main points. List the evidence for each of your main points. So see your evidence so that you can actually look at it and see that if an evidence you have listed wrongly supports the conclusion. Okay, so if you can do that, you will always prevent fallacies from occurring. Number three, investigate your own personal fallacies. So there are some people who think that whatever they say, they are right. It is not an education. And an intellectual does not behave like that. You don't put yourself and then promote your ego as if you are all in all. You can't do that. Every person, including myself, leading you in this lecture or facilitating this lecture, is capable of committing fallacies. So then, I have to be able to investigate my own fallacies if I commit them and say, yes, this is a fallacy. I think I shouldn't have gone this way. If you do that and you are honest with yourself, it will help you to become conscious and always avoid any trend of falling into the trap or committing fallacies that will cause you in a number of ways. Number four, give the appropriate amount of proofs for your claims. Any claim you make sure that the proofs you are offering, they are appropriate. They are appropriate. If they are inappropriate, you will land into fallacy. So if you look at the various fallacies we have looked at, you will see basically they're about that. Either the evidences offered for the claims are inappropriate, or the conclusion driven driven for in support for the premises are inappropriate. So you always have to pay attention to that. Remember, broad claims need more proof than narrow claims. If you are making a broad claim, note that you are going to state more proofs. But if you make a narrow claim, probably your proofs will be very small, will be scanty, may even be narrow. So pay attention to that. Number five, fairly characterize the arguments of others. In other words, pay attention closely and don't wrongly misinterpret the arguments other persons put forth. So if you are making an assessment of someone's argument, do it well. If it is, let's say, a deductive reasoning, don't go and evaluate it as though it is an inductive reasoning. If you do that, you, the person doing the evaluation, will be the one committing the fallacy. So you have to watch against those tendencies. So in conclusion, fallacies can seriously interfere with our ability to arrive at the truth. They can seriously interfere with our ability to arrive at the truth. But knowing what the fallacies are afford us some protection in either cases. So it is good today we are getting to know about fallacies, and having to know about fallacies in themselves supports you to avoid them. If we can identify several of the most common patterns of incorrect reasoning, we are less likely to slip into them ourselves or to be fooled by them. So you see, all the fallacies that we have just gone through, you have learned through this lecture from the previous weeks to today. If you pay attention to them closely and you keep practicing, you keep looking at the trend carefully, then you will be capable of dodging those fallacies. It means that it will not be easy for you committing them because you know them. So if you talk about ad hominem, you know the nature of ad hominem. If you talk about suppressed evidence, you know the nature of suppressed evidence. If you talk about false dichotomy, you know the nature of false dichotomy. So if you pay attention to them closely and you try to observe them, and you try to also look at other examples and how they are like, every time you will escape yourself from committing those fallacies. So, in summary, we have looked at almost everything. I think so. That is where we'll end our lecture for today. If you have any question, you may please ask as we come to an end.